poor little girl was selling flowers on the street and was humiliated by a group of men, until a young billionaire appeared and changed her life. Snow was falling in light flakes that Thursday night, the kind of snow that gives the city a special glow, as if someone had dusted sugar over buildings and sidewalks. Street lamp lights reflected on the wet ground, creating golden mirrors on the dark asphalt. On Fifth Avenue, traffic was constant even at that hour. People in a hurry, wearing elegant coats and carrying shopping bags, moved between luxury restaurants and expensive stores that stayed open for the holiday season. The noise of cars and the buzz of conversations formed the typical urban soundtrack of a winter evening. Amid this scene, Maeve seemed invisible. She was a girl too small for her 6 years of age, holding a small basket of flowers in her hands. She wore a faded red coat with 2 missing buttons and a grey cap that partially covered her messy brown hair. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her green eyes stayed sharp, shifting from one side of the sidewalk to the other, looking for potential buyers. The lights from the store windows reflected on her face, highlighting the paleness of her skin and her small lips, cracked from the icy wind. Her hands, protected only by fingerless wool gloves, clutched the basket as if it were a treasure. Her flowers weren't anything special, just daisies and a few violets she had gathered in the park during the afternoon. They were tied with a thin piece of string, forming small improvised bouquets. But Maeve held them as though they were rare treasures, shyly extending them to anyone who passed by. "Flowers, sir. Flowers, ma'am." Her voice was almost a whisper, easily muffled by the city's noise. No one stopped. No one looked. It was as if Maeve didn't exist in that universe of expensive coats and important appointments. People automatically veered away from her, some casting pitying glances, others simply ignoring her presence, as if ignoring poverty could make it disappear. The little girl was already used to it. She moved along the sidewalk with the resilience of the invisible, those the city swallows and then pretends do not exist. From time to time, she stopped to blow on her hands, trying to warm them, before going back to offering her flowers. Across the street, the doors of Le Petit, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, opened. A group of 4 men in suits came out, talking loudly, napkins still in their hands and the smell of expensive wine in their breath. They crossed the street toward the parking area, still laughing at some joke shared during dinner. Maeve saw them approaching and, summoning all her courage, walked toward them. Maybe they were in a good mood from the expensive meal. Maybe they'd want to bring flowers to their wives. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment she finally sold something. "Flowers, sir." "They're only $5, she said, her voice slightly louder than usual, trying to be heard above the street noise. One of the men, the tallest, stopped and looked down. For a second, Maeve thought she would finally sell her first bouquet of the night. But then the smile that formed on the man's face wasn't kind, it was condescending, almost cruel. "Look at this, guys. We've got a little vendor here." He leaned toward Maeve, his warm breath mixed with the smell of expensive wine. "Where'd you get those flowers, girl? Are they so ugly that someone paid you to take them away?" The others laughed, stopping in a circle around her. Maeve stepped back but felt the cold wall of a building at her back. She was cornered. "I picked them in the park," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. Her gaze fell to her own feet, clad in worn, wet boots from the snow. "In the park? And you expect someone to pay for those weeds?" said another man, pointing at the basket with disdain. He adjusted his expensive glasses on his face and laughed. "This is so pathetic, it's actually funny." $5 for that," added a third, turning to his friends with a theatrically horrified expression. "Not even the homeless would take that for free." The laughter grew louder, drawing curious looks from passers-by, but nobody stopped to help. Nobody ever did. The fourth man, shorter and with a face reddened by alcohol, reached out and touched one of the flowers, pulling it hard enough to damage the small white petal. "Look at this. They're almost dead. The only thing sadder than these flowers is whoever's trying to sell them." He waved the flower in front of Maeve's face before letting it drop to the ground and stepping on it deliberately. Maeve clutched the basket to her chest, as if trying to protect the remaining flowers. A knot formed in her throat and her eyes began to burn. She knew she shouldn't cry. Crying only made things worse. Crying showed weakness, and on the streets, weakness was dangerous. But she was only 6, and the tears came anyway. "Maybe we should buy them all and throw them in the trash. Do humanity a favor," said the first man, prompting more laughter. "No one should have to look at those things." "Or maybe we should teach her how to make real arrangements," suggested the man with glasses, leaning closer, invading Maeve's personal space. Lesson number 1. Dead flowers aren't worth anything. The laughter intensified. People walked around them, some looking away, others casting curious glances, but no one intervened. It was just another urban scene, another moment of casual cruelty the city swallowed daily. Maeve felt the first tears rolling down her face, mingling with the snowflakes melting on her pink cheeks. She tried to wipe them away quickly with the sleeve of her coat, but fresh tears replaced the old ones. "Hey, she's crying now," noted the red-faced man, leaning closer. "Maybe we should teach her about quality standards. Or maybe she should go back to school and learn something useful," laughed the tall man, "assuming she goes to school at all." Maeve could no longer hold back her sobs. Her small shoulders shook as she tried to make herself even smaller, as if she could disappear between the cracks in the asphalt. The flowers in her basket seemed to wilt further under the weight of cruel laughter. That was when a different voice cut through the scene. $50 for all the flowers. The voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made the 4 men turn around simultaneously. Standing a few steps away was Silas Mercer, wearing a dark overcoat and a grey scarf. At 30 years old, Silas already had the kind of presence that made people pay attention when he spoke. He wasn't tall, nor particularly intimidating. There was something in his eyes, direct, intense, impossible to ignore. "What?" asked the tall man, clearly irritated by the interruption to his fun. Silas took 2 steps closer, closing the distance between him and the group. His expression was serene, but there was something in his gaze that made the men instinctively step back. "I said, $50 for all the flowers," Silas repeated, his voice still calm but with a hint of steel that hadn't been there before. He turned to Maeve, and his look softened. "If that's all right with you, of course." Maeve, still with tears in her eyes, nodded silently, unable to believe what was happening. Silas pulled out his wallet from the inside pocket of his coat and took out a $50 bill, holding it out to Maeve, who took it with trembling fingers. "You should be ashamed," Silas said, now addressing the men. There was no anger in his voice, just a simple, direct statement, which somehow made it even more impactful. 4 grown men against a child. Is that what you call fun? The tall man opened his mouth to reply, but Silas continued, still calm. What kind of man feels better by making a child cry? What kind of courage is that? He shook his head, as if pondering a particularly disappointing riddle. Look at yourselves. Expensive suits, luxury watches, coming out of a restaurant where you probably spent more on a meal than this girl sees in a month, and yet you need to put down a child to feel superior. The silence that followed was heavy. The 4 men now looked uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact with Silas or Maeve. Some people passing by slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. "Hey, we were just joking," the man with glasses finally mumbled, adjusting his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. "Yeah, just a joke," added the red-faced man, already taking a step back. "We didn't want to hurt anyone." "A joke?" Silas repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Interesting. It just doesn't look very funny to her, does it?" He gestured toward Maeve, who was still pressed against the wall, holding her now empty basket against her chest like a shield. "Look, man, we don't need this," said the tall man, clearly annoyed but also uneasy. "Let's go, guys." "Yeah, we should go, as one of the others agreed quickly. "It's late." They began to walk away, muttering among themselves. One of them glanced back briefly, as if to say something else, but changed his mind when he met Silas's unwavering gaze. "It was just a joke," repeated the tall man as he moved off, as if he needed to convince himself as much as the others. Silas waited until they were far enough away before turning fully to Maeve. He kneeled so he was at her eye level, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Maeve nodded, still clutching the $50 bill as if she couldn't believe it was real. Her green eyes studied Silas with caution, but also with hesitant gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "No need to thank me," Silas replied with a soft smile. "Actually, I should be thanking you. I've been looking for flowers all day and couldn't find any as pretty as yours." A small smile appeared on Maeve's face, brief but genuine, before disappearing again behind years of street-learned caution. "It's cold out here," Silas commented, noticing how she trembled slightly. "There's a coffee shop on the corner. Would you like to have some hot chocolate before going home? They serve the best marshmallows in town." The girl hesitated, studying Silas's face as if looking for any sign of danger or deceit. The street had taught Maeve that kindness rarely came without a price. But there was something in this stranger's eyes, a simple honesty, a genuine compassion, that made her nod timidly. "I like hot chocolate," she said, her voice small but a little steadier. The warm corner coffee shop was cozy, with amber lights creating a golden glow over dark wooden tables. The warmth enveloped Maeve like a hug as soon as she entered, making her realize just how cold it was outside. The smell of cinnamon and chocolate filled the air, blending with the aroma of freshly ground coffee. Silas chose a table near the window where they could watch the snow falling outside. He helped Maeve remove her damp coat and hung it carefully on the chair next to his own overcoat. "2 hot chocolates, please," Silas said to the waitress when she approached. "With extra marshmallows," he added, giving Maeve a conspiratorial look. A shy smile appeared on the girl's face, the first Silas had seen, before it quickly vanished behind that cautious expression that seemed strangely mature for someone so young. "So," Silas began after the waitress walked away, "you like flowers?" It wasn't a question, but Maeve nodded anyway. "My favorite is the daisy," she said after a moment, her voice so soft Silas had to lean in to hear. "They're strong. They grow anywhere." There was something deeply moving about the way she said it, as if she were describing not only the flowers, but herself, a small survivor, thriving under conditions that would defeat most. When the drinks arrived, Maeve wrapped both hands around her mug, as if trying to absorb every bit of warmth. She blew on it carefully before taking a small sip. Her eyes widened slightly at the taste. "Good?" asked Silas. She nodded, taking a bigger second sip. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who don't need to fill every second with words. A silence of mutual acceptance. Silas watched as she drank, noticing details he hadn't seen before on the street. The small tear in her blouse sleeve, carefully stitched with thread of a different color. The makeshift bandage on her index finger. The way her eyes constantly checked the exits of the place, a survival habit difficult to break. How her eyes looked so much older than 6 years. "Do you sell flowers every day?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Maeve paused her drinking and considered the question, as if weighing how much she could share with this stranger who had shown her kindness. "When it's not too cold," she finally replied. "Or raining. People don't buy flowers when it's raining." Silas nodded, as if that made all the sense in the world. "And why do you sell flowers?" he asked gently. Maeve fiddled with the spoon in her hot chocolate tool, slowly swirling it in the brown liquid. Marshmallows floated and spun, creating little whirlpools. For a moment, Silas thought she wouldn't answer. "To buy food," she finally said, her voice small and practical. "And sometimes to pay for a warm place when it's too cold." Something twisted in Silas's chest, a mix of compassion and admiration for the bravery of such a small child facing such a big world. "I see," was all he managed to say. They finished their hot chocolate in silence. Silas wanted to ask more where she lived, if anyone was taking care of her, why she was out alone selling flowers on a cold winter night. But there was something in the way Maeve guarded herself, the caution she maintained even as she relaxed slightly over the hot chocolate, that made him respect her boundaries. "Thank you for the hot chocolate," Maeve said when she was finished, neatly folding the napkin by her empty mug. "And for the flowers." "It was my pleasure," replied Silas. "Would it be too forward to ask your name?" She studied him for a moment before answering. "Maeve." "That's a beautiful name," he said, smiling. "I'm Silas." She nodded, as if memorizing that information. "I need to go now," Maeve said, sliding off the chair, her empty basket in hand. Silas wanted to ask where she was going, if she had a safe place to stay, if someone looked after her. But something about the way she carried herself, independent, careful, stopped him. "It was nice meeting you, Maeve," he simply said. "Thanks again," she replied, then added almost as an afterthought, "and for making them stop." Before Silas could respond, she put on her faded red coat, adjusted the cap over her brown hair, and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. He watched her through the foggy window, her small figure becoming less distinct as the snow continued to fall, until she vanished completely into the shadows and darkness. Silas stayed seated there for a moment, the empty mug in his hands. Something had changed inside him. The image of that small girl selling flowers in the cold, all alone in an indifferent world, was burned into his mind. On his way home, he couldn't stop thinking about her green eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world, about her small hands that should have been playing with toys, not tying flowers to sell in the cold, about her soft voice that talked about buying food with a frightening maturity for her age. As he entered his quiet, empty apartment, Silas realized that the emptiness he had felt for years seemed different now, sharper, more painful, as if he had suddenly become aware of how comfortable his life was, and at the same time how devoid of purpose. A little flower seller had changed something inside him, without even trying. The question now spinning in his mind was what he would do about that change. Silas fell asleep thinking about wilted flowers and green eyes, about hot chocolate and falling snow, about how the world can change completely in the span of a single night. 3 weeks had passed since that night on Fifth Avenue. Winter tightened its icy grip on the city, turning puddles into mirrors of ice and covering trees with white mantles of snow. Mornings were especially harsh, the air so cold it felt like it could slice through exposed skin. Silas thought about Maeve every day. In the most unexpected moments, the image of the little girl with her basket of flowers popped into his mind. During important meetings, while driving home, even while making his solitary breakfast, he wondered where she was, if she was okay, if she had enough to eat. He had gone back to Fifth Avenue multiple times at the same hours, hoping to find her again. But Maeve had vanished like a small urban ghost, swallowed up by the thousands of stories the city hides in its streets. That Saturday morning, the sky was clear, though the cold remained bitter. Silas decided to walk through Madison Square Park for no particular reason other than to escape the walls of his apartment. The park was nearly empty at that hour. Few ventured out in such low temperatures. That's when he saw her. Maeve was crouched near a flower bed, digging in the snow with bare fingers, looking for something. Her red coat seemed even more faded under the bright morning light, and her grey cap had slipped slightly, revealing messy brown hair. Silas stopped, as if he'd hit an invisible wall. For a moment, he just watched the girl, noticing how her fingers were red from the cold, how she occasionally blew on them to warm them before going back to digging in the snow. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hello, Maeve," he said softly when he was only a few steps away. The girl lifted her head quickly, her green eyes wide with alarm. For an instant, she looked ready to run. Then recognition lit her face. "Mr. Silas," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Silas felt a wave of relief at being recognized. "You remember my name?" "You remembered mine," she replied simply, as if that explained everything. "What are you looking for?" Silas asked, indicating the little hole she had dug in the snow. Maeve hesitated, as if considering whether to share her secret. "Winter flowers," she finally said. "Sometimes they grow beneath the snow. They're really rare and really strong." Silas felt something tighten in his chest. The image of a small child digging through the snow for rare flowers, with bare, reddened fingers, seemed oddly symbolic. "Can I help?" he offered, kneeling beside her, not caring that the snow soaked his pants. Maeve shrugged, but shifted slightly to the side, making room for him. They dug in silence for a few minutes. Silas noticed her hands weren't just red, but also covered in small cuts and calluses, hands that worked far more than they should for someone so young. "You're not selling flowers today?" he asked casually. "Too cold," Maeve replied, not looking up. "People stay inside when it's like this." And the flowers die too quickly. She said it without self-pity, just a practical observation about the world around her. I've been hoping to find you again, Silas said after a pause. I came back to that spot several times. Maeve looked at him then, her green eyes studying his face as if searching for something specific. Why? She finally asked. The question caught Silas off guard. Why, indeed? He himself wasn't entirely sure. How do you explain to a stranger, let alone a child, that a brief encounter had left such a deep mark? I wanted to make sure you were okay, he answered honestly. Maeve went back to digging in the snow, processing his response. I'm okay, she said, though the tremor in her red fingers told a different story. Silas decided to change tactics. Have you had breakfast today? The slight pause before she answered said it all. Not yet. I know a place nearby that serves great pancakes, Silas said, trying to keep his voice casual. I'm hungry. Would you like to join me? Maeve stopped digging. Her eyes met Silas's again, and he could see the internal battle, the need versus caution, hunger versus the street-learned distrust. Do they have real maple syrup? She finally asked, her small voice. Silas smiled. The best in the city. She considered for another moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Maple Morning, just 2 blocks from the park, was cozy, with red leather booths and polished wooden tables. The smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and the warmth inside was a welcome relief from the cold outside. They sat in a booth by the window. Maeve looked both out of place and fascinated at the same time, her eyes roaming the room, taking in details, assessing people. When the pancakes arrived, Maeve's eyes widened at the amount of food. A small scoop of ice cream slowly melted on top of each stack, covered in golden maple syrup. Looks amazing, Silas commented, picking up his fork. Let's give it a try. That seemed to break the spell. Maeve picked up her own fork with still reddened fingers and cut a small piece, almost as if she feared the food might vanish if she was too greedy. When the first bite touched her tongue, her face changed. A genuine smile, the first Silas had truly seen, lit up her features, making her briefly look every bit the 6-year-old child she was. Good? Silas asked, though the answer was obvious on her face. Maeve nodded enthusiastically, cutting a second piece slightly bigger. Can I ask you something? Silas said after a moment. Maeve looked at him, wary but curious. She nodded. Where do you live? The girl lowered her gaze, staring at the table. Her small fingers traced invisible patterns on the polished surface. Different places, she finally replied. Sometimes the shelter on 28th Street, but they don't let you stay during the day, only at night. And they have lots of rules. And when you're not at the shelter? Silas asked gently. Maeve shrugged. I find places. There's a spot behind the laundromat that's warm because of the machines, and the library lets me stay inside when it's really cold, if I stay quiet. She said it as though it were completely normal for a 6-year-old to navigate the city's survival system alone. And your parents? Silas hesitated, not wanting to push but needing to understand. Something shifted in Maeve's face, a shadow passing through her green eyes, a slight hardening of her lips. My mom's gone, she said simply. She got very sick, and then she was gone. To heaven. That's what the lady at the shelter told me. Silas felt his heart clench. I'm sorry, Maeve. It's okay, she replied, with that resignation that had no place in a child so young. It's been almost a year. And your dad? Silas asked, though he suspected the answer. Never met him, Maeve said, without emotion. It was just me and Mom, and now it's just me. The words hung between them, simple and devastating in their stark truth. I should go back to the park, Maeve said, looking out at the sun climbing higher in the sky. Can I come with you? Silas asked. I'd like to see if we can find those winter flowers. Maeve studied him for a moment, as if gauging his sincerity. If you want, she finally said, but it's boring. Just digging in the snow. I don't think it would be boring, Silas answered honestly, and so began a routine that, over the following weeks, would become the center of Silas's life. Every day, he met Maeve in Madison Square Park. On weekdays, it was late afternoon after he left work, On weekends, they met in the morning and spent hours together. They always started with a meal. Silas noticed how Maeve gradually began to eat more, how color slowly returned to her cheeks, how her eyes became brighter. In the park, he accompanied her on her expeditions. They searched for flowers hidden under the snow, watched birds, fed squirrels. Maeve knew every corner of the park, every secret hiding spot, every place where urban wildlife gathered. Silas discovered she had never been to school. Her mother had taught her the basics. She could read a little, knew some numbers, but her most impressive knowledge was about nature. She identified birds by their songs, knew the habits of the park's small animals, recognized which plants could survive the harsh winter. "How do you know all this?" Silas asked one day, while they watched a bright red cardinal against the white snow. "By watching," Maeve replied simply, "and my mom showed me. She said the city has green secrets most people don't see." Green secrets. Silas liked the phrase, and she was right. He had lived in this city for years and had never noticed half the things Maeve pointed out. The persistent buds pushing through cracked concrete, the nests hidden in seemingly bare trees, life pulsing even on the coldest, greyest days. As the days went by, Silas began rearranging his life around these meetings. He left work earlier, delegated tasks he had once insisted on doing personally, declined evening engagements that interfered with his time in the park. His boss noticed the change. "Everything okay with you, Mercer? You used to be the last to leave." "Never been better," Silas replied, and realized it was true. He started bringing books to read with Maeve, sitting on a park bench, stories about children and animals, adventures in magical forests, tales of courage and friendship. At first, he read to her. Later, he began teaching her to read better, helping her sound out difficult words, praising her progress. There were days Maeve didn't show up. On those days, Silas felt an inexplicable emptiness, a worry that gnawed at him. He looked for her in the park, walked the nearby streets, even went by the shelter she had mentioned, without the courage to go in and ask about her. Then, the next day, she would reappear as if nothing had happened, and the relief Silas felt was almost overwhelming. When the sun began setting one Friday afternoon, casting long bluish shadows on the snow, Silas checked his watch. "It's getting late," he noted. "It'll be dark soon." Maeve glanced at the sky. "Yeah," she agreed, gathering her little snow sculptures. "The birds are already heading to their nests." "Where are you going now?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "The shelter," she replied. "It's Friday. It's not usually too full." "Maeve," he said, kneeling so he was at her level, "I've been thinking. The forecast says tomorrow we're in for a big snowstorm, maybe the worst of the winter." She nodded. "The squirrels are gathering more nuts than usual. They always know when a heavy snow is coming." Silas smiled at the observation, then got serious again. "Do you have somewhere to stay if the shelter is too crowded?" Maeve shrugged. "I'll find somewhere. I always do." "Tomorrow," he said finally, "if the storm is as bad as they say, I'd like you to consider an offer. I have a big apartment with a spare bedroom no one uses. It's warm and safe. You could stay there until the storm passes." Maeve's eyes widened slightly in surprise. She studied Silas's face, looking for any sign of trickery or ulterior motives. "You'd take me to your home?" she asked, as if the idea were entirely foreign. "Yes," Silas confirmed, "if you want to. No pressure, just an option if you need a safe place." Maeve considered the offer, her small face serious and thoughtful. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice small but firm. "Great," Silas replied. "We'll meet here at the usual spot around noon." "Noon," Maeve confirmed. They said their goodbyes at the park entrance, Maeve heading one way toward the shelter and Silas another, toward his empty apartment. He watched the small figure go, her faded red coat against the white snow, until she turned a corner and disappeared from sight. As he walked home, Silas felt a mix of hope and apprehension. Maybe tomorrow he could give Maeve a real shelter from the storm. The city was facing the worst snowstorm of the winter. Huge flakes had been falling non-stop since dawn, accumulating on the streets, turning sidewalks into slippery trails and making it difficult to get around. The cold was biting, the kind that cuts to the bone, and even those well prepared for a brutal winter hurried to find shelter. Silas watched from his office window on the 30th floor as the world below turned into a white sea. The radio news was already warning about possible blackouts in some parts of the city, and most of his colleagues had decided to go home early, before public transport became completely unreliable. But Silas had a commitment he couldn't postpone. At noon, he would be at Madison Square Park, as promised. His mind kept returning to that little figure in the faded red coat, alone in the storm. Would she go to the park in this weather? Had she found shelter? Was he worrying too much, or not enough? He left the building at 11, determined to reach the park on time, despite the conditions. The trip that normally took 20 minutes took nearly an hour. The streets were almost deserted, except for a few stubborn taxis and emergency vehicles. Silas pressed on, stepping into snow that was now above his ankles. The park looked surreal under the storm. The trees, covered in white, looked like ghostly figures against the grey sky. The paths had vanished under a thick layer of snow. There was no one in sight. Any sensible person would be indoors on a day like this. Silas headed to the spot where he usually met Maeve, near the now frozen fountain. His stomach dropped when he didn't see her there. He looked around, hoping to spot some sign of her, but the park seemed completely abandoned. He should have known. No one would come to a park in a storm this severe. He was about to leave when he noticed a small movement under a nearby tree. Approaching, he discovered a makeshift shelter, branches carefully intertwined to form a structure that, though rudimentary, provided some protection from the falling snow. And inside that shelter, curled up like a small animal, was Maeve. "Maeve!" Silas exclaimed, rushing over. "What are you doing here in this weather?" The girl looked up, her green eyes shining against the pallor of her face. "You said noon," she replied simply, as if it were obvious she'd be exactly where they agreed, regardless of conditions. Silas felt a wave of emotion, admiration for her determination, worry at seeing her out in the cold, guilt for not being more explicit. "I said if the storm was bad, you could stay at my apartment," he explained. "I didn't imagine you'd come to the park in this weather." Maeve shrugged. "A promise is a promise," she said, something in her voice suggesting that promises were rare and precious in her world. "You're right," Silas agreed, offering his hand to help her out of the shelter. "And I keep my promises. Let's get home before we end up buried in snow." He noticed how she flinched slightly at the word home, as if the concept were both strange and appealing. She took his hand, her small fingers ice-cold against his. Out on the street, Silas tried to hail a cab, but after 15 minutes with no luck, he decided they would have to walk. His apartment was about 20 blocks away, normally a comfortable distance but challenging in the current conditions. "Think you can walk that far?" he asked Maeve, worried about her small legs in the deep snow. She gave him a look that was almost amused. "I walk around the city every day, Silas. I can walk." He smiled. "Of course you can." But even so, bending down, he offered, "How about a ride on my shoulders? At least until we get past the worst parts." After a moment's hesitation, Maeve agreed, and soon she was perched on Silas's shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair to steady herself. The walk was slow and arduous. The snow kept falling, limiting visibility and making each step a challenge. But Silas barely noticed the physical discomfort. He focused on the small presence on his shoulders, the almost imperceptible weight, the occasional whispered comment about something she observed, the implicit trust in how she gradually relaxed against him. Silas's apartment was on the 10th floor of a nice building on the Upper East Side. It wasn't ostentatious, but it certainly indicated comfort and financial stability. The doorman raised his eyebrows on seeing Silas enter with a child on his shoulders, but had the good sense not to ask questions. Inside, the heating was immediate and welcome. Silas gently lowered Maeve, and she stood in the middle of the living room, looking around with wide eyes. The space was large and well lit, even on a grey day like this. Elegant but comfortable furniture, artwork on the walls, a bookshelf filled with books, a completely different world from hers. "Would you like a hot bath?" Silas asked, noticing her wet clothes from the snow. "Then maybe we can eat something." Maeve nodded, still absorbing her surroundings. Silas's bathroom was almost the size of the shelter where she sometimes slept. The tub filled quickly with warm water, and he added a bit of bubble bath, something he'd bought on impulse and never used. "The water's warm, not too hot," he explained. "Can you undress on your own?" Maeve nodded, a bit of color returning to her cheeks. "I'll leave some towels here, and one of my t-shirts for you to wear after. Take as much time as you need. I'll be in the kitchen making something warm to eat." He closed the bathroom door, giving the girl her privacy, but stayed nearby, ready to help if she needed anything. In the kitchen, Silas prepared a simple vegetable soup, carrots, potatoes, onions, whatever he found in the fridge. The aroma soon filled the apartment, bringing a feeling of normalcy to a situation far from ordinary. After about 20 minutes, Maeve appeared at the kitchen door. Silas's t-shirt looked like a dress on her, reaching down to her ankles. Her freshly washed hair was combed back, and her cheeks were slightly pink. She looked both smaller and older at the same time, a contradiction Silas had noticed before. "I feel better," she said, her voice still soft but stronger. "The soup's almost ready," Silas replied, motioning to the kitchen table already set for two. "Have a seat." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Silas watched how Maeve carefully held the spoon, how she blew on each spoonful before bringing it to her lips, how she briefly closed her eyes at the warmth of the soup slipping down her throat. "Is it good?" he asked. Maeve nodded enthusiastically. "The best I've ever had." Silas doubted that. It was a simple soup made in a rush, but her comment warmed him in a way even the heating couldn't. "They say the storm will last a few days," he said casually. "They're advising everyone to stay home." Maeve looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. "You can stay here," Silas said, answering the unspoken question. "I have a spare room I don't use. Actually, I've never used it." "Why do you have a room you don't use?" Maeve asked, her childlike curiosity finally emerging after the shock of the cold. Silas shrugged. "When I bought the apartment, I figured I might need it someday, for guests, maybe. Or," he didn't finish the sentence, "for a family he never formed. For children he never had." After the meal, Silas took Maeve to that spare room. It was simple but comfortable, with a single bed, an empty closet, and a small desk. The walls were a very light shade of blue, almost white, and a single painting of a boat at sea decorated the wall opposite the bed. "It's not much, but it's warm and safe," Silas said. Maeve walked around the room, touching the bedspread as if it was something precious. "It's perfect," she said, her voice almost inaudible. Silas made the bed with clean sheets and an extra blanket. He found an old pair of pajamas that had shrunk in the wash and still looked huge on her, but at least they were better than just his t-shirt. "If you need anything during the night, my room's right next door," he explained. "Don't hesitate to call me." Maeve nodded, sitting at the edge of the bed, her feet dangling above the floor. For a moment, she seemed like she wanted to say something, but then just murmured good night and lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Silas turned off the light, leaving only a small lamp on. "Good night, Maeve," he said, closing the door partially. He didn't expect to sleep much that night, worried as he was about his little guest. The storm still raged outside, lashing at the windows, but inside the apartment it was warm and quiet. Eventually, the fatigue of walking through the snow overcame him, and Silas fell asleep. He woke the next morning to the weak winter sunlight, trying to pierce the still heavy clouds. For a moment, he felt disoriented. Then the memories of the previous day came rushing back. He got up quickly and headed to the guest room. The bed was empty, perfectly made. A wave of panic seized him. Had she left already, in that storm? "Maeve!" he called, stepping into the hallway. "Here!" came her voice from the living room. Silas found Maeve sitting on the floor near the bookshelf, leafing through one of his books. She was still wearing the borrowed pajamas, her brown hair messy in a way that somehow felt right in a home setting. "Good morning," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Did you sleep well?" Maeve nodded. "Your bed is really soft. Are you hungry? I can make pancakes." Her eyes lit up. "Can I help?" And so Silas found himself teaching a 6-year-old how to make pancakes on a stormy morning. Maeve was an attentive helper, watching every step, asking questions, eager to try it herself. There was a surreal normality to the scene, as if they had done this hundreds of times before. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Maeve and Silas settled into a quiet routine. He worked on his laptop in the mornings while she explored the bookshelf. In the afternoons, they played board games Silas dug out of a closet or watched movies he deemed suitable for her. He taught her how to play chess and was surprised at how quickly she learned the rules. When the storm finally subsided and the streets began to be cleared, Silas expected Maeve to say something about leaving, but she didn't, and he, secretly relieved, didn't bring it up either. A week went by. Maeve was still sleeping in the guest room. Silas had bought her clothes, nothing fancy, just the basics. She'd organized her few belongings in the dresser, and the desk was now covered in drawings she made during the day. One Sunday afternoon, while Silas was making lunch, Maeve appeared in the kitchen holding a picture frame. "Who's this?" she asked, showing a photo of a middle-aged woman with a gentle smile and the same brown eyes as Silas. He stopped what he was doing, a bit surprised. The photo usually stayed in his bedroom, on the nightstand. Maeve must have gone in while he was busy. "That's my mother," he replied, taking the frame. "She passed away a long time ago." Maeve moved closer, studying the photo more closely. "She looks kind." "She was," Silas said, sitting at the kitchen table. Maeve sat beside him. "The kindest person I've ever known." "Were you little when she went away?" Silas nodded. "I was 8, not much older than you." Maeve's eyes went a bit wide. "Like my mum?" "Yes," Silas agreed. "Like your mum." There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, but laden with a mutual understanding that went beyond words. "What happened after?" Maeve finally asked. "When she went away?" Silas took a deep breath. He hadn't talked about this in years. "My dad took care of me. He is a busy man, very focused on work. He did his best, but it wasn't the same." "You missed her?" It wasn't a question, but Silas answered anyway. "Every day. I still do." Maeve gently touched the photo. "Me too. I miss my mom." "Of course you do," Silas said softly. "And you always will. That's not bad, you know. It means the love we feel for them is still here." He touched his own chest. Maeve mimicked the gesture, placing her small hand over her heart. Her eyes were moistened, but she didn't cry. "Can I put the photo back?" she asked, carefully picking up the frame. "Sure," Silas replied. "Or, if you'd like, we can put it in the living room. That way you can see it whenever you want." Maeve thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." Together, they found a spot on the living room bookshelf for Silas's mother's photo. It was a small adjustment in the apartment, but it meant something bigger, a recognition of a shared history, a common loss, an understanding that went beyond words. That night, when Silas checked on Maeve before bedtime, he found her still awake, gazing out the window at the snow-covered city. "Everything okay?" he asked, stopping at the door. Maeve turned. "Silas, do you think it's possible to have 2 mums, one in heaven and one in your heart?" The question caught him off guard, but he answered honestly, "I think our hearts have room for many people we love, whether they're here or not." She seemed satisfied with that answer and got into bed. Silas pulled the blanket up over her and wished her good night. As he left the room, he realized something fundamental had shifted between them. The bond that began on that winter night on Fifth Avenue had deepened into something stronger, more permanent, and he knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that Maeve would not return to the streets. This room, which had stayed empty for so long, had finally found its purpose. 3 months had passed since the big snowstorm. Winter was finally giving way to a timid spring, with small green buds emerging in parks and flower beds around the city. Silas's apartment, once neatly organized and somewhat impersonal, now had unmistakable signs of Maeve's presence. A pair of colorful sneakers in the hallway, children's books on the living room shelf, drawings pinned to the refrigerator with magnets. The routine they had created worked surprisingly well. Silas took Maeve to school in the morning, a small private institution that agreed to enroll her mid-year after a few phone calls and a generous donation. In the afternoon, he picked her up, and they spent the rest of the day together doing homework, cooking, or just talking about the little events of the day. But Silas's corporate life was entering a critical phase. The investment firm where he worked was negotiating a major merger, and as CFO, his presence was indispensable. Long days at the office became inevitable, and for the first time since Maeve had arrived, he found himself needing to stay at work beyond her school dismissal time. "I'm going to have to stay late at the office the next few days," Silas announced over dinner, trying to sound casual. "Maybe until 9 or 10 at night." Maeve froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Her green eyes, always so expressive, revealed something Silas couldn't fully decipher. Surprise, fear, resignation. "That's okay," she said, turning her attention back to her plate, her voice small and controlled. "I'll be fine alone." "No, you won't be alone," Silas corrected quickly. "I found someone to stay with you. Miss Parker. She's a student teacher and comes highly recommended." Maeve nodded, still not looking up. "Have you done this before?" "What? Hired a babysitter?" "No." She finally lifted her eyes. "Left me with someone." The question hit Silas like a punch. There was so much unsaid in those simple words, so much fear. She had been abandoned before. Part of her expected it to happen again. "No, Maeve, I've never done this before," he answered, choosing his words carefully. "And I'm not leaving you. I'm just working late, and I'll come home every night. Miss Parker will be here just to make sure you're safe and cared for while I'm gone. It's temporary." She nodded again, processing the information with the seriousness she reserved for important matters. "Do you promise you'll come back every night?" "I promise," Silas said, realizing he had never made a promise with such conviction. Miss Parker arrived on Monday after school. She was in her early 20s, with brown hair tied in a ponytail and a friendly smile. She wore jeans, colorful sneakers, and carried a bag full of books and art supplies. "Sure you must be Maeve," she said, kneeling to Maeve's eye level when Silas introduced them. "I'm super excited to spend afternoons with you." Maeve looked at her, then at Silas, as if seeking confirmation that this was okay. He nodded encouragingly, and she finally offered a small wave. "I see you like to draw," Miss Parker went on, pointing to Maeve's creations on the fridge. "I brought some cool stuff we can use." During the first week, as everything seemed to go well, Miss Parker reported daily that Maeve was a sweet, cooperative child, though a bit reserved. They did homework together, prepared a simple dinner, and the babysitter read stories to her before bedtime. Silas always got home after Maeve was asleep. He'd tiptoe into her room, adjust the blanket, and sometimes spend a few minutes just watching her sleep, feeling a mix of guilt and gratitude. In the morning, he tried to make up for it by preparing elaborate breakfasts and chatting excitedly about what they would do on the weekend. But as the days passed, Silas began to notice subtle changes in Maeve. She spoke less at breakfast. The drawings on the fridge became fewer. Once, he found her staring pensively at the photo of his mother, which now held a prominent place on the living room shelf. "Is everything okay, little one?" he asked one morning, noticing she had barely touched her favorite pancakes. "Yes," Maeve replied, poking at her food with a fork. "I'm just a bit tired." Silas wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but the clock was ticking. Another important meeting awaited him. Another day he would leave Maeve in someone else's care, someone kind and competent, but not him. "We can talk more tonight," he promised, planting a quick kiss on top of her head. "I'll try to come home earlier, okay?" Maeve only nodded, not lifting her gaze from the plate. But he didn't manage to come home earlier that night, nor the following one. The merger was reaching a critical stage, and every minute seemed essential. By the time he finally got home, late at night, Miss Parker was reading or working on her own studies in the living room, and Maeve had been asleep for hours. Almost 2 weeks had passed like this when Silas finally managed to leave the office at 6 on a Thursday. He had delegated some tasks, rescheduled meetings, done whatever it took to have an evening at home with Maeve. Opening his apartment door, he was greeted by the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Miss Parker's cheerful voice mixed with a quieter laugh he recognized as Maeve's. For a moment, he just stood there, listening to that rare and precious sound. "Silas," Maeve exclaimed when she saw him enter the kitchen. "You're early." There was surprise in her voice, but also a strange hesitation, as though she didn't quite know how to react to his unexpected presence. "I managed to leave sooner today," he explained, setting his briefcase on the counter. "I thought we could have dinner together." "We were baking cookies," Miss Parker said, brushing flour from her hands onto her apron. "Maeve is an excellent kitchen helper." The evening went by peacefully. They finished baking cookies, had dinner, and Miss Parker left early. Silas read Maeve a story before bed, something he hadn't done in weeks, and felt a stab of guilt when he realized how she snuggled against him, soaking up every moment of closeness like water in a desert. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, determined to prepare a special breakfast. Passing by Maeve's room to check if she was still asleep, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Peering inside, he saw something that made his heart clench momentarily. Maeve was awake, sitting on the bed, carefully placing her things into a small red backpack. The few clothes she owned, the journal where she pressed dried flowers, her toothbrush, everything was being methodically packed, as if she were preparing for a journey, or leaving. Silas felt a chill in his stomach. He knocked softly on the door. "Maeve, what are you doing?" The girl jumped, looking at him with wide eyes, as if caught in the act. I was just... Her hands froze on the backpack, uncertain. Silas stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Looks like you're packing your things to go somewhere," he said calmly, despite the rising panic in his chest. Maeve lowered her gaze to the backpack, then to her hands. "I don't want to be a burden," she finally said, so softly Silas almost didn't hear. "A burden," he repeated, genuinely confused. "Why would you be a burden?" "You're never home anymore," she answered, still not looking at him. "You have to pay someone to stay with me. I know you have important things to do at work." "Maeve," Silas said, feeling a lump in his throat. "Look at me." She slowly raised her eyes, and what Silas saw in them broke his heart. A mix of resignation and acceptance no 6-year-old should ever have. "You're not a burden. You could never be," he said firmly. "If I've been away a lot, that's my mistake, not yours, and I'm going to fix it." "I don't want to mess up your life," she insisted. "You were happy before I came along. You had your job, your clean apartment, and—" "No," Silas interrupted gently. "I wasn't happy, Maeve. I existed. I worked. I ate. I slept. And then I did it all over the next day. There was no joy in this home before you came." He looked around the room at the drawings on the walls, the little objects they'd collected on their outings in the park, the sense of life and purpose she had brought. "You taught me the value of having someone around," he continued, feeling the words flow straight from his heart. "Before you, I came back to an empty apartment every night. No one to talk to. No one who cared if I arrived early or late. No reason to come home, except to sleep and do it all over again the next day." Maeve watched him intently, absorbing every word. "If I haven't been around much, it's not because you're a burden. It's because I still need to learn how to balance what truly matters. But I'm learning." He reached out and gently zipped the backpack closed. "And I can't learn if you leave." That morning, Silas called the office and said he'd be working from home. It was the first time in years he'd prioritized something over work. And surprisingly, the world didn't end. The merger would go on, the markets would still operate, and the firm would survive without his physical presence for one day. In the weeks that followed, a new routine emerged. Silas reorganized his schedule so he could be home every night in time to have dinner with Maeve. When he occasionally had to stay late, Miss Parker still came by, but it was the exception, not the rule. He also started working from home on Fridays, turning them into his special day with Maeve. The change didn't go unnoticed. The little red backpack stayed tucked under her bed, no longer a way out but simply a backpack. And Maeve slowly began to blossom in a way Silas hadn't seen before. 1 month after the backpack conversation, Silas came home from work to a sight that stopped him in his tracks at the door. The apartment that had once been meticulously organized and somewhat impersonal had been transformed. Small vases of wildflowers occupied nearly every available surface. Colorful drawings covered not only the fridge, but also sections of the walls, carefully taped up. Little notes, written in Maeve's still uneven handwriting, were stuck in unexpected places, Simple messages like, "Good morning," on the bathroom mirror, or "Have a great day" by the coffee maker. In the center of the living room, hung over the couch, was a handmade banner proclaiming our home in large, colorful letters, decorated with small pressed flowers. "Surprise!" Maeve exclaimed, popping out from behind the couch. "I decorated the house. Miss Parker helped me with the banner." "What is all this?" Silas asked, genuinely astonished as he looked around. "You said I made this house better," Maeve explained, suddenly a bit nervous. "So I thought I'd do more, make it feel more like home." Silas glanced around the apartment, taking in every detail. This place that once reflected only his solitary, work-centric life now pulsed with color, life and personality. Maeve hadn't simply adapted to his home, she had transformed it completely. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice tinged with anxiety at his prolonged silence. "Like it," he repeated, feeling an unexpected tightness in his throat. "Maeve, it's perfect. Absolutely perfect." The smile that lit up her face was like the sunrise. In every room, every corner, Maeve had left her mark, not in an intrusive or chaotic way, but with a sensitivity that respected the original space while making it undeniably theirs. The apartment, once merely a place to sleep between workdays, had become a vibrant, living home. That night, as he tucked Maeve into bed, Silas realized the little girl he'd found selling flowers in the cold wasn't, as she once feared, the wrong child. She was exactly who needed to be there, turning an apartment into a home, filling a void he hadn't even known existed until she arrived. And when Maeve murmured goodnight for the first time before falling asleep, Silas knew they had both finally found where they belonged. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon while Silas worked on his laptop at the kitchen table and Maeve drew quietly across from him. It was a normal domestic scene for them now, he answering emails while she created new colorful worlds on paper, occasionally sharing a comment or question. The unexpected sound made them both look up. Unannounced visitors weren't part of their usual routine. "Are you expecting anyone?" Maeve asked, her pencil hovering in midair above a half-finished drawing of an impossibly flower-filled garden. "No," Silas replied, frowning. "Must be a mistake. I'll be right back." He opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with graying hair in a tight bun, discreet framed glasses, and a neatly pressed navy blue blazer. She held a leather folder and observed him with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked, her voice professional and neutral. "I'm Elaine Winters from the Department of Children's Services. May we talk?" Silas felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. He knew this moment would eventually come. In the 6 months since Maeve arrived, in the 4 since she had started school, he had known the system would eventually notice a child who, officially, belonged nowhere. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice calm despite his heart hammering. "Please, come in, Ms." Winters stepped over the threshold with a determined stride and observant gaze, evaluating the apartment with the trained eye of someone looking for signs of neglect or unfitness. Silas closed the door behind her, wondering how best to approach this. "I was working in the kitchen," he said. "Maeve's there too, drawing." In the kitchen, Maeve had stopped drawing. Silas could see she was completely still, like a small wild animal sensing a predator. Her green eyes went wide at the sight of the official-looking stranger, and then shifted to Silas, seeking reassurance. "Maeve, this is Ms. Winters," Silas introduced, trying to keep his voice neutral. "She works with children." The social worker approached the table, smiling at Maeve, a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Maeve. It's nice to meet you," she said. "That's a lovely drawing. I see you like flowers." Maeve didn't answer. Her gaze went from Miss Winters to Silas, her expression unspoken. "Is it safe?" "It's okay," Silas assured her. "Miss Winters just wants to talk a bit." "Actually," Miss Winters interjected, "perhaps we could talk privately first, Mr. Mercer, if it's not an inconvenience." "Maeve," Silas said, "would you mind going to your room for a bit? I promise this won't take long." For a moment, it looked like Maeve might protest, but then she nodded silently, gathered her pencils and paper, and left the kitchen with careful steps. casting one last anxious glance back before disappearing down the hallway. Silas offered Mrs. Winters some coffee, which she politely accepted. As he prepared the drinks, he tried to organize his thoughts, how to explain his situation without seeming irresponsible, how to defend Maeve staying with him without sounding desperate. Telling the truth seemed best. "I imagine you're wondering how Maeve ended up here," Silas began, placing 2 cups on the table and sitting across from the social worker. "Actually," Miss Winters said, opening her folder and taking out some papers, "I have a fairly clear idea. We received an alert from the school when she was enrolled. That was 4 months ago, if I'm not mistaken." Silas felt a wave of surprise. "And you waited all this time to investigate?" Ms. Winters took a sip of her coffee. "The system is overloaded, Mr. Mercer. And honestly, when we saw the child was regularly attending school, had good grades, seemed well-fed and well-dressed, and was living with an adult who has no criminal history and adequate financial resources, well, she wasn't considered an urgent priority." She paused. "But that doesn't mean the situation can continue indefinitely without legal status." "I understand," Silas said, feeling a knot in his stomach. "So what happens now?" "Now we need to regularize Maeve's status," the social worker replied, setting her cup on the table. "From what I understand, there are no known relatives, correct? From what Maeve told me? No. Her mother died just over a year ago. She never met her father." Mrs. Winters jotted notes on a form. "And how exactly did you two meet, Mr. Mercer?" Silas recounted their first encounter, the cold night, the men mocking Maeve, buying the flowers, the hot chocolate, then the subsequent meetings in the park, the snowstorm, the decision to give her temporary shelter that became permanent. "I'm fully aware that I should have contacted the authorities from the start," he concluded. "But I was afraid she'd end up in the foster system, possibly suffering more than she already had. And the longer it went on, the more—" He paused, searching for the right words. "The more it felt like she belonged here. With me." Ms. Winters studied him for a long moment, her professional face revealing little of her thoughts. "Mr. Mercer, you understand that taking in a minor without legal authorization is serious, correct?" "Regardless of intentions." "I do," Silas answered, holding her gaze, "and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make it right, if that means filing for legal guardianship or even formally adopting her. That's precisely why I'm here, in fact, to start that process." She paused, and something in her eyes softened slightly. "We have too many children in the system and not enough foster homes. A child Maeve's age, who's already adjusted well to a stable environment, with a financially capable caregiver and no criminal record. It wouldn't make sense to remove her from here just because of bureaucratic issues." Silas felt a momentary relief, but he knew there was a but coming. "However," Ms. Winters continued, "that doesn't mean we can ignore legal procedures. You'll need to apply for temporary legal guardianship, undergo a formal home evaluation, a more thorough background check, interviews, and a supervision period before we can proceed to a formal adoption request. Even if everything goes smoothly, we're talking at least 6 months, possibly longer. And in the meantime, can Maeve stay here?" "Yes, as long as preliminary visits raise no concerns." Mrs. Winters took out more papers from her folder. "Here are the initial forms you'll need to fill out. There's a list of required documents at the end." Silas nodded, looking at the stack of paperwork. "And what are my chances of being granted permanent custody in the end?" Ms. Winters closed her folder before answering, "As long as you meet all the requirements and no unexpected problems arise, I'd say they're good. But at it, Mr. Mercer, remember Maeve's well-being is the priority. If at any point we determine a different arrangement would be better for her, that's the route we'll take." It was a veiled warning, and Silas understood it clearly. Nothing was guaranteed. Miss Winters then asked to speak briefly with Maeve alone. "Standard procedure," she explained. Silas reluctantly agreed and called Maeve back to the kitchen, explaining that Mrs. Winters wanted to talk to her while he waited in the living room. The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Silas could hear the low murmur of voices coming from the kitchen, but couldn't make out any words. When the door finally opened and they both emerged, Maeve's face was completely blank, the carefully neutral mask she wore when dealing with complex emotions. "Well, I think that's all for today," Ms. Winters said, heading to the door. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Mercer. I'll come back in 2 weeks for a formal home visit." When the door closed behind the social worker, a heavy silence filled the apartment. Maeve lingered in the hallway, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "Maeve?" Silas called gently. "Are you okay? What did she ask?" The girl shrugged, still not looking at him. "Stuff. If I like it here. If you're good to me. If I want to stay." "And what did you say?" "The truth." She finally looked at him, her green eyes unreadable. "Can I go to my room now? I'm tired." During dinner, she remained quiet, answering Silas's questions with one-word replies, pushing her food around more than eating it. When he tried to explain about the guardianship process, saying it was just a formality to ensure she could stay officially, Maeve only nodded, her face carefully neutral. "You don't need to worry," Silas assured her. "It's just a process we have to go through. In the end, everything will be fine." "Okay," she answered, her voice small and distant. That night, Silas had trouble sleeping. Something about Maeve's behavior worried him deeply, but he couldn't put his finger on it. After hours of tossing and turning, he decided to check if she was sleeping well. Opening Maeve's door quietly, he was greeted by a jolt of alarm. The bed was neatly made but empty. The curtains fluttered in the breeze at the open window, and the little red backpack was gone. Maeve had run away. Panic seized Silas instantly. He raced through the apartment, checking every room, calling her name, already knowing he was alone. On the fridge, held by a magnet, he found a note written in Maeve's uneven handwriting. "I'm sorry. It's better this way. Thank you for everything." Silas dressed quickly and rushed out into the cold spring night, his heart pounding painfully. There was only one place she might go at a time like this, the place where everything had begun. The park was silent and empty at that late hour, the trees casting elongated shadows beneath the streetlights. Silas walked rapidly along the familiar paths, his eyes scanning every bench, every bush, every hidden corner. He found her exactly where they had met the second time, crouched near the flower bed where she used to look for her winter flowers. But it wasn't winter anymore, and instead of snow, small green sprouts poked timidly through the damp earth. "Maeve," he called softly, so he wouldn't startle her. She looked up, her eyes wide in the darkness. The small red backpack was beside her, and she was hugging her knees to her chest. "Go away," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just go away." Silas stepped closer and knelt on the ground to meet her eye to eye. "I can't do that, little one. I can't just leave you here. It's better this way," she insisted, tears starting to fall. "It's better to leave before they take me, before they say you can't keep me." "No one's going to take you from me," Silas said firmly. "That's why we're going through this process, to make sure you can stay." "You don't know," she exclaimed, her voice rising. She asked if I remembered my mom's name, where we used to live, if I was sure we had no relatives. What if they find someone? What if they decide I can't stay with you? Silas realized her real fear wasn't just ending up in a shelter, but being handed over to strangers who might claim some distant blood relation, of building a life with him only to lose it because of some bureaucratic twist. "Maeve," he said, his voice soft but resolute, "look at me." Reluctantly, she lifted her tear-filled eyes. "I'm not going to let you slip out of my life," he said, each word clear and steady. "No matter what happens, no matter who shows up, I'll fight for you. With every resource I have, with all my strength, because you're my family now." Tears rolled freely down her cheeks. "Promise?" "I promise," Silas replied, opening his arms. Maeve hesitated for just a second before throwing herself into his embrace, sobbing against his chest. Silas held her tightly, feeling her small body tremble with the force of suppressed emotion. "Let's go home," he whispered once the sobs began to subside. "It's getting cold out here." Maeve nodded against his chest, still clinging to him. Silas stood, scooping her up in one arm and grabbing the little red backpack with the other. As they walked back to the apartment under the silent stars, He knew the road ahead would be hard, filled with forms, interviews, and evaluations. But he also knew, with a certainty beyond reason, that in the end, they would stay together. Because sometimes families aren't formed by blood or official documents, but by hearts choosing to remain together no matter what. Attorney Thomas Bennett's office was on the 20th floor of a downtown building. Through the large windows, you could see an impressive panorama of surrounding skyscrapers, but Silas barely noticed the view. His attention was fixed on the middle-aged man seated across from him, sifting through the documents spread out on a polished mahogany desk. "Well, Mr. Mercer, the paperwork seems in order," said the lawyer, adjusting his glasses as he skimmed the pages. "The home visits have been completed with positive evaluations. The background check came back clean, and the interviews with Maeve clearly indicate she's well-adjusted and happy in your home." Silas nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. The last 8 weeks had been an emotional roller coaster. After Maeve's attempt to run away, he had thrown himself fully into the legal guardianship process, determined to ensure she never again felt scared of being taken away. "What about the next steps?" he asked. "Ms. Winters mentioned we could consider full adoption once the temporary guardianship is granted, instead of waiting the full 6 months. The lawyer folded his fingers over the documents. "Yes, that's possible. Given the special circumstances, no known relatives, the established bond between you two and the fact that Maeve has essentially been under your care for the past 7 months, we can request an expedited timeline from the judge." He paused. "I must emphasize, however, that it's not guaranteed. Much depends on the judge assigned to the case." Silas leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mr. Bennett. I want her to be my daughter. Legally, officially, permanently." He took a deep breath. "She already is, in every way that truly matters. We just need the papers to reflect that." The lawyer regarded his client for a moment, noting the determination in his eyes. Bennett had handled many adoption cases over his career, but rarely had he seen such a level of commitment. "I understand completely, Mr. Mercer," he replied. "And frankly, based on everything I've seen so far, I believe we have a strong case. I'll prepare the petition for full adoption immediately, to be filed as soon as temporary guardianship is granted." He adjusted his glasses again. "There's one more thing I'd like to ask." "Yes." "About Maeve's name. When the adoption is finalized, would you like to change her last name?" That's quite common in cases like this. The question surprised Silas, though in retrospect he realized it was to be expected. "Maeve Mercer," he said, testing the sound of it. A smile crept onto his face. "Yes, I'd like that. If she wants it too, of course." "Excellent," Bennett agreed, making a note. "We'll include that in the petition. We'll need her formal consent during the process, but that shouldn't be a problem. Given what we know of your relationship." What neither man knew was that, outside in the hallway, Maeve was quietly sitting on a chair, her legs dangling above the floor. When Silas mentioned the lawyer's appointment that morning, she'd asked to come along, saying she didn't want to stay with the babysitter. The truth was that she wanted to be present, to witness what was happening in her life, even if it was just waiting outside. The office door was slightly ajar, not intentionally, but enough for fragments of the conversation to slip into the corridor. That was how Maeve heard Silas's words, simple, direct, life-changing. "I want her to be my daughter." 6 words that altered everything. Maeve felt something strange in her chest, like her heart had tripped for a moment before resuming its beat. During the months she'd lived with Silas, part of her had always expected it all to end. He'd grow tired of her. The system would take her away. The temporary life they shared would come to its inevitable close. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility. "Maybe I get to stay forever." The receptionist, seated at a desk across the hallway, smiled kindly at Maeve. "You all right, sweetie? Want me to get you a glass of water?" Maeve shook her head, unable to speak. She was too focused on the new feeling growing inside her, something that, had she more experience with positive emotions, she'd have recognized as hope. When Silas emerged from the office minutes later, He found Maeve apparently engrossed in a book she'd brought in her backpack. If he noticed the slight flush in her cheeks or the unusual brightness in her eyes, he said nothing. "All done here," he said cheerfully. "What do you say we grab lunch at that place with the milkshakes you like?" Maeve nodded, carefully tucking her book away. As they walked to the elevator, she held Silas's hand, a gesture that had become second nature, and squeezed a bit tighter than usual. The call came the next morning, while Silas was making breakfast and Maeve finished getting ready for school. "Silas," said the voice on the other end, authoritative and to the point, "I need to see you in my office this morning. Urgent matter." Edward Mercer, at 60, was the epitome of a successful executive. As founder and CEO of Mercer Financial, he ran one of the city's most respected investment funds with the same iron discipline he applied to every aspect of his life. His office, on the top floor of the corporate building, was a monument to his vision of success. Minimalist but immaculate, completely focused on efficiency and results. Silas arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, as instructed. His father stood by the window, gazing at the city below like a general surveying a battlefield. "Sit down," Edward said without turning. Silas obeyed, watching his father's straight back, the perfectly trimmed grey hair, the broad shoulders beneath an Italian suit tailored to fit. Even in his 30s, with a well-established career and an independent life, Silas sometimes felt like a boy in his father's presence. "I got an interesting phone call yesterday," Edward began, finally turning to face his son. "Thomas Bennett. Apparently you hired him for an adoption proceeding." He moved to sit behind his imposing desk. "I didn't think I'd hear about such a thing from a corporate lawyer I occasionally golf with." Silas kept his gaze steady. "I was going to tell you once the process was further along." "Further along?" Edward raised his eyebrows. "From what I understand, you've been housing this child for months. Not to mention you're about to become a single father at 30, while occupying a crucial position in our company during the biggest merger in our history." He paused, studying his son. "That doesn't seem like the kind of decision one hides from family." "It wasn't intentional," Silas replied. "It all happened gradually, and then, well, life got complicated." Edward let out a sigh that seemed laden with decades of frustration. "Silas, I've always admired your intelligence, but sometimes I wonder if you use that intelligence to make wise decisions." He opened a folder on his desk, the same one Bennett had sent, detailing the adoption process. A 6-year-old girl, no known family, found selling flowers on the street. He snapped the folder shut. "Have you thought about the implications, the long-term commitment, the sacrifices required?" "Yes," Silas answered simply. "I've thought about it all." "And what about your job? Do you have any idea how many hours it takes to raise a child properly? Hours that will be taken away from your career, from your future at this company." Edward leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Are you willing to throw your career away for a child?" The question hung in the air between them, charged not only with the words but everything left unsaid. The legacy Edward had built, the expectations he'd always had for his only son, the path he'd meticulously laid out since Silas was a boy. Silas looked at his father for a long moment, seeing beyond the stern executive facade to the man who had raised a son alone after losing his wife too soon. A man who, in his limited way, had loved and protected his child without ever quite knowing how to express it. "Dad," Silas said finally, his voice calm and steady, "do you remember what you told me when I was 10 and I asked why you worked so much?" Edward frowned, surprised by the change in subject. "Not specifically." "You said you worked to build something that would last, something that would make a difference in the world." Silas paused. "Maybe we have different interpretations of what making a difference means, but meeting Maeve, caring for her, watching how she grows each day, that changed my perception of what really matters." "Silas." "I inherited Mom's good heart," Silas continued, gently cutting him off. "And with that heart, I'm going to make a difference in her life, just like you, in your own way, made a difference in mine." Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like he would snap back, as was his habit when challenged. But something in Silas's eyes, a quiet determination, a certainty beyond logic, made him hesitate. "You've already made your decision," Edward finally said, not as a question but a statement. Yes, Silas confirmed. Maeve needs me. And, to my surprise, I discovered I need her too. Silence settled between them, not the tense silence of their usual disagreements, but something different, almost reflective. Your mother would have liked her, Edward said suddenly, surprising Silas. It was rare for his father to bring up his late wife unprompted. She always had a soft spot for lost causes and wounded hearts. Maeve isn't a lost cause, Silas replied firmly. She's just a child who needs a home. Edward studied his son for a long moment, as if seeing him in a new light. Well, he said at last, I suppose we'll need to adjust your workload to accommodate your new responsibilities. He cleared his throat, resuming a pragmatic tone. I'll talk to Richardson about reallocating some of the less critical projects, and maybe we can arrange for partial remote work. Silas blinked, momentarily stunned by this unexpected shift. That would be really helpful, he managed. Don't think this means I fully agree with your decision, Edward added quickly, but if you're determined to go through with it, I'd rather you do it with the right support. He paused. And maybe I should meet this girl at some point. She'd like that, Silas said, feeling a lump in his throat. She loves hearing stories about family. Edward gave a brief nod, then picked up another document on his desk, a clear sign the personal conversation was over and business awaited. Leaving his father's office, Silas felt as if he had passed some unknown ritual, not exactly approval, but acknowledgement, a small step toward a new definition of family. That afternoon, picking Maeve up from school, he noticed a subtle change in her, a contained excitement, a barely hidden anticipation in her eyes. During dinner, she asked about what it was like when Silas was little, about his mother, about growing up in the Mercer family. Later, as he helped her brush her teeth before bed, Maeve finally asked with a studied casualness, "How long does it take for the papers to be ready? The ones you talked about with the lawyer?" Silas nearly dropped the toothbrush. "You heard my conversation with Mr. Bennett?" Maeve nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "The door was a tiny bit open." Silas sighed, unable to scold her when he himself had a long history of eavesdropping as a child. "Well," he explained, "first comes the temporary guardianship, which should be granted in the next few weeks. Then, if all goes well, we can start the full adoption process, which might take a few more months." Maeve took in the information with her trademark seriousness. "And when it's done," she continued, staring at the sink, "I'll have your last name, like other dads and kids." "If you want," Silas replied gently. "Maeve Mercer." "Sounds nice, doesn't it?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I guess maybe I'll stay," she said, almost to herself. "Maybe I really will stay." In that simple moment, with toothpaste on her chin and hope in her eyes, Maeve finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a permanent home, a real name, a family that wouldn't disappear at dawn. Family Court was surprisingly quiet that Wednesday morning. Silas had expected bustling hallways, raised voices, and the tense atmosphere he associated with legal proceedings. Instead, there was an almost reverent calm, as though the building itself recognized the solemnity of bonds formed and broken within its walls. He and Maeve were seated on a polished wooden bench outside the courtroom. She swung her legs, which didn't reach the floor, wearing a sky-blue dress chosen especially for the occasion. Her brown hair was braided elaborately by Miss Parker that morning, decorated with small white artificial flowers that resembled tiny daisies. "Are you nervous?" Silas asked, noticing how she kept smoothing the hem of her dress. Maeve shrugged, an expression that on any other 6-year-old might suggest indifference, but on her indicated she was processing intense emotions. "What if the judge says no?" she finally asked, her voice so soft Silas had to lean in. "He won't say no," Silas replied with a confidence that went beyond the lawyer's assurances. "We have everything we need, Ms. Vanter's reports are excellent, and all the paperwork is in order." Maeve nodded, but her gaze remained on her hands. "Besides," Silas continued, leaning closer to whisper conspiratorially, "I heard Judge Collins has a soft spot for stories like ours, especially if they involve little flower sellers." That finally earned a timid smile. You're making that up. Maybe just a little, Silas admitted, winking at her, but I have a good feeling about today. The courtroom door opened and Thomas Bennett emerged, his impeccable suit contrasting with the warm smile he rarely showed in professional settings. They're ready for you, he announced. The judge wants to keep this simple and informal. Silas stood, extending his hand to Maeve. She grasped it tightly, and together they followed the lawyer into the room. The courtroom was smaller than Silas had imagined, with dark wood paneling and tall windows letting in the soft morning light. Judge Collins was already seated behind his elevated desk, reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he reviewed some documents. He was a kindly-looking man, with thick white hair and bushy eyebrows that rose in acknowledgement when they entered. The hearing was surprisingly brief. Judge Collins reviewed the documents, asked Silas a few direct questions, and chatted kindly with Maeve. He seemed particularly interested in how they'd met and in Maeve's school progress. "Well," he finally said, peering over his glasses, "I see no reason to prolong what is clearly a beneficial arrangement for all involved." He picked up his pen and signed the document in front of him with a flourish. "By the authority vested in me by the state, I hereby declare Maeve to be your daughter, Mr. Mercer, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." And so, in less than 30 minutes, what began with a little girl selling flowers in the snow and a lonely man seeking meaning beyond work ended in the formation of a new family, formally and legally recognized. Outside the courthouse, under an exceptionally blue autumn sky, Silas, Maeve, and Bennett said goodbye to Miss Winters, who shook Silas's hand firmly. "Congratulations," she said, with more warmth than she'd shown on any of her official visits. "This is the kind of outcome we strive for." Once everyone else had left, Silas kneeled before Maeve, pulling an official envelope from his suit pocket. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. "It's your copy." With near-reverent care, Maeve opened the envelope and took out the adoption certificate. Her eyes traveled over the official text, the seals, the signatures, but mostly over the name printed in dark, formal letters, Maeve Mercer. "It's official," she murmured, touching the letters as if verifying they were real. "I have a real last name now." "You've always had a real name," Silas said gently, "but now we share the same one." Maeve kept studying the document for a few more moments, her small face serious. Then, without lifting her gaze, she asked in a voice so soft it nearly got lost in the street noise, "Can I call you Dad now?" The question hit Silas like a wave, not in shock, but in pure emotion. Throughout the process, they had discussed practical aspects of adoption, name changes, legalities, what being an official family meant. But never once had he pushed Maeve to call him anything specific. "Yes," he answered, his own voice suddenly husky. "If you want to." At last, she lifted her eyes from the paper, meeting his. "I want to." Two simple words carrying the weight of a deliberate choice, a heart that had found its place in the world. Silas swallowed the lump in his throat. "Well, in that case, I think we need to celebrate properly," he said, standing up and offering his hand. "What do you say we go to that ice cream parlor you like, the one with 50 flavors? Maeve's smile widened. "Can I get 2 different flavors?" "Today you can get 3, Silas replied, prompting a delighted gasp. The ice cream shop was only a few blocks from the courthouse, on a tree-lined street where the leaves were just beginning to show the golden and red hues of autumn. They walked hand in hand, occasionally swinging their arms in a comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the months. At the shop, Maeve seriously considered each option in the frosty display, finally deciding on strawberry, mint chocolate, and vanilla with cookie bits. Silas chose a simpler coffee flavor, and they sat by the window, watching people pass by as they savored their sundaes. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, noticing Maeve's contemplative expression as she played with a spoonful of strawberry ice cream. She pondered for a moment before replying, "I think I was meant to stay." The simplicity and depth of the statement caught Silas off guard. "How so?" "When I lived on the street," she explained, still focusing on her ice cream, "I always had to leave. The shelter when it was too crowded, the library when it closed, the warm places when people realized I was there." She lifted her eyes then. "I never really belonged anywhere, not for real. But now, she waved her spoon vaguely, indicating the space between them. Now I know I was meant to stay with you, in our home. Such profound certainty from someone so young left Silas momentarily speechless. Instead, he reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Yes, he said at last, you were meant to stay, we both were. At the next morning, they began a new ritual. Silas hung the framed adoption certificate on the wall of Maeve's room, alongside the drawings and photos, already decorating the space. Then they headed to the kitchen together to prepare a special blueberry pancake breakfast, her favorite. Are you sure you don't want to wait until next week to start the new school? Silas asked as he set the table. After the adoption, they decided Maeve would transfer to a school closer to home. The previous one, though good, had been chosen in a rush when Maeve was still in a temporary situation. Now, with everything official, it felt like the right time for a more thoughtful change. I'm sure, Maeve replied firmly, helping set out the silverware. I want to start right away. With my new name. Oakwood Primary was only 4 blocks from their apartment, a red brick building with large windows and a tree-filled yard where children were already running and playing when they arrived. Maeve wore her new uniform, a plaid skirt, white shirt and navy blue blazer, and carried a backpack they'd picked out together, embroidered with small flowers. Remember what we agreed, Silas said, adjusting a strap on her backpack. If you get lonely or don't like something, you can call me and I'll come get you. I know, Dad, she replied, the words still new on her tongue but sounding more natural every day. But it'll be fine. I met the classroom and my teacher yesterday. Silas nodded, admiring the resilience and courage of this small person who was now officially his daughter. All right. I'll be here at 3 o'clock to pick you up. Maeve nodded, then, in a gesture that took Silas by surprise, opened her arms for a hug. He wrapped her in his arms, feeling her light weight against him, the strawberry shampoo scent in her hair. Have a good day, Maeve Mercer, he whispered into the top of her head. She pulled back, smiling. You too, Dad. Then she turned and walked confidently through the gate, her small figure soon blending in with the dozens of uniformed children in the schoolyard. Silas stayed a few extra minutes, watching her until the bell rang and the kids lined up to go inside. Only then did he head off to work, feeling a strange sense of lightness, as if a burden he had carried for so long had finally found its rightful place. At the office, Edward Mercer stopped by Silas's office mid-morning, pausing briefly in the doorway. Well, he asked, in the terse style that characterized their professional interactions. It's done, Silas answered, unable to hide a smile. She's officially a Mercer now. Something flickered across his father's face, perhaps pride, perhaps acceptance before he gave a curt nod. Good, he said simply. Your mother would have been proud. And without waiting for a response, he continued on his way. Coming from Edward Mercer, that was as close to a blessing as Silas could hope for. 3 o'clock took forever to arrive, but finally Silas was back at the school gate, scanning for Maeve among the children leaving in noisy groups. When he saw her, his heart leapt. She came running, her face lit by a grin that seemed to brighten the entire yard, her blazer tied casually around her waist, and a few strands of hair coming loose from her braid. Dad, she called, launching herself into his arms with enough force to almost knock him over. Guess what? I made 2 friends, Emma and Sophia. And Miss Campbell said my drawing was the best in class, and there's a turtle in the room named Franklin, and I get to help take care of him on Fridays. The words poured out in an excited torrent, a stark contrast to the wary, reserved child he'd first met months before. Silas listened to every detail, every name, every little adventure from her first day as they walked home hand in hand. There's also a gardening club after class on Tuesdays, Maeve went on, barely pausing for breath. Miss Campbell said I can join if you sign a form. They plant flowers and vegetables in the school garden. Can I, Dad? Please. Of course you can, Silas replied, laughing at her excitement. Sounds perfect for you. Their walk home was filled with more stories of the day, each word and gesture from Maeve exuding a confidence and joy that made Silas's heart brim with gratitude. This was the childhood she deserved, safe, enriching, full of new discoveries and friendships. That night, after dinner, Silas brought a small box from the shelf. "I have something to show you," he said, sitting beside Maeve on the couch. Inside the box was a simple wooden frame containing a photograph. It had been taken in the park a few weeks earlier. On a rare day, Edward insisted they needed a proper family photo. It showed Silas and Maeve sitting on a bench surrounded by autumn leaves, both smiling at the camera. "I thought we could hang it here in the living room," Silas suggested. "What do you think?" Maeve took the frame, studying the image carefully. Her fingers traced the outline of their faces, and a small smile crept across her lips. "Our family," she said simply, glancing from the photo to the rest of the living room. The space that, over the months, had been transformed by colorful drawings, small flower vases, children's books on a low shelf, and countless moments shared. "Yes," Silas agreed, feeling a completeness he never imagined possible before a little flower seller walked into his life. "Ours." Together, they chose a spot on the living room's main wall, and Silas carefully hung the frame. Then they sat on the couch to admire it, Maeve snug at his side, her head resting on his shoulder. The apartment was quiet except for the steady ticking of the clock and the occasional honk from the street below. The city kept to its frenetic pace, but here, in this small sanctuary they'd created, time seemed to slow, allowing each moment to be fully felt, completely lived. The papers had made it official. The love had become law. But the truth was, long before the documents were